Okay, good morning, or afternoon, as the case may be. So let's conclude our study of the history of justice in economics. And where we left off last time was in the age of laissez-faire, with the Industrial Revolution, with the rise of liberalism and the gold standard. And I want to start now by looking at some representative figures in this movement. So we're going to start off with Nassau Senior, Karl Marx, and Alfred Marshall. So, beginning with Nassau Senior, 1790 to 1864. And with this new economy, this economy of vice, comes an outright war on the poor. And Nassau Senior is the leading advocate for that. For Senior, political economy was not concerned with happiness or with justice, only with the acquisition of wealth. He was the guiding light of the Liberal Party, which had taken control of England in 1832. And he was also the father of the poorhouse and the central bank. Now, why is that? Well, the poor actually didn't want to work in the new factories. They didn't want to work 12 hours a day for so little pay. And England had a well-developed welfare system at the time called the Speenenland system. Well, it was felt that the abolishment of the welfare system was necessary to discipline the lower classes. Okay. And that without, so long as there was a welfare system, then the poor simply would not go to work in these factories. Now, he's also famous for equilibrium theory, and his theory says that gluts, as they were called at the time, that is, recessions, were simply impossible. All it could mean was that some goods were priced too low and others were priced too high. But since economics was just a trade in things, then the amount of things created was equal to the amount of things you could buy other things with. So gluts were impossible. Now, he said this at a time when recessions occurred on average every 4 years. He doesn't actually have any important theories. But what he did do is set the research agenda for neoclassical economics. So, equilibrium theory, utility prices, the distribution of incomes, and a value-free economics. These would be the entire research agenda of the 19th century. Now, looking at Karl Marx, is the next figure, who is a reaction against all of this. 1818 to 1883. Alienation and class warfare. Now, obviously, he's a very important figure, so let's look at him in some detail. We'll look at the idea of alienation, the idea of class warfare, and Marxist economics, pre-Marxist socialism, Marx and capitalism, and then the failure of Marxism. So starting with alienation. This actually comes from Hegel, and you can also find similar things in both St. Paul and St. Augustine. Now, man can examine himself objectively. That is, he can treat himself as an object, and in that sense he has to alienate himself from himself. Now, in religion, God becomes transcendent. This is obvious to us today, but really, for primitive man, God is not something different from the natural order. Now, the division of labor creates a master-slave relationship. Labor becomes a commodity. Man is separated from himself, from human life, from the natural order, from everything. And labor is transformed into capital and becomes just another private property. Well, this leads, Marx will say, to class warfare. Now, Hegel deals in abstractions, at least Marx claims. Marx wants to deal in history, with what actually happens. So property and the division of labor leads to class-based societies. Ideas, he says, spring from practice. Ruling ideology depends on control of the means of production. Now, this is an interesting idea. When we look at the history, we tend to focus on key figures and believe that their ideas kind of drive things forward. So, for example, here we have looked at Mandeville, and this represents a great change from economics as virtue to economics as vice. But what was prior? The fact is, Mandeville was looking at an already established fact and then trying to add some justification to it. So this is basically what Marx is saying, is that practice is going to drive ideology, is going to drive ideas, is going to drive thought. But he says each age sows the seeds of its own replacement. Its very success leads to its downfall. So the victory of capitalism must mean the end of capitalism. So, just a word here about Marxist economics. He actually combined three figures: Smith, Ricardo, and Proudhon. We haven't looked at Proudhon, but basically he is the founder of what we would call today anarcho-libertarianism. From Ricardo, he gets this idea of the surplus value, and this imposes tremendous costs on labor because capital claims everything over subsistence. Now, Marx did make some very useful contributions to economics, especially in exchange and circulation theories. And he noted that the need for constant expansion leads to a falling rate of profit, which will doom capitalism. And the poverty of the masses would erode support for the system. So, and here he's following Proudhon, he's saying if you just abolish private property, the state would run the economy for the proletariat. Well, Proudhon advocated the abolishment of private property, and with it the abolishment of the state, because it's the state is required to have private property. Marx kind of flips Proudhon. So you would have to have the state to run the economy for the proletariat. All right. But when this would happen, when this happens, then the state and religion along with it would lose their function and would just wither away. You have to compare this with pre-Marxist socialism. So this comes from Proudhon. It's what we would call today anarcho-libertarianism. So without the state, there would be no property. There would only be use of property. And you could only have as much property as you could actually use. You couldn't rent out property. You couldn't hire managers to manage excess property, etc., etc. Therefore, property would tend to be evenly divided. So, this is an entirely anti-statist view of socialism. Without the state, property would be limited to use. It would be personal property. And the economics then would function without rents or without oppression. And people would organize as needed. No state would be required. So if people needed something, if they needed police protection, they'd organize it themselves. If they needed bridges or roads, people would organize and just accomplish these things without the state. We need to look at Marx and capitalism. The fact is, Marx was not really anti-capitalist. In fact, he was very, very impressed by capitalist production technique. And he viewed capitalism as essential to destroying the old religious order of society. And he believed that the superabundance created by capitalism would make questions of justice irrelevant. There'd be so much, the problem would be distributing it. So history would end with the victory of the proletariat over capitalism. Now this becomes a pseudo-religion. So he gets this idea of sort of deifying history from Hegel. Well, the failure of Marxism. The fact is, he said very little about the transition to socialism or about how the communist state would actually function. He thought that his solutions would arise from the workers themselves, and it was not the place of any intellectual to tell the workers what their state would look like. Well, the problem is that this means that Marxism cannot be subjected to a Marxist critique because you don't know what it would look like. But in fact, what happened is that new state bureaucracies replaced old capitalist bureaucracies as the new ruling class. And this happened wherever communism was established. You just had the replacement of capitalist bureaucracies with state bureaucracies. So these bureaucracies justify themselves by Marxist rhetoric, but not by Marxist practice, for the simple reason that there is no Marxist practice. What he did not foresee is surplus values being shared with the workers in some sort of modified socialism, or workers gaining power through unions to get higher wages and better benefits, etc., etc. All right, but the really pivotal figure we have to look at is not Marx, and it is not Senior. It's Alfred Marshall. This is the man who single-handedly establishes what we now know as economics. So 1842 to 1924. This is the marginalist revolution. And with Marshall, we finally have a viable alternative to the labor theory of value. Using marginal utility, you could explain all prices, including wages. Now, throughout the 19th century, there had been efforts to quantify utility and make it useful in the mathematics of economics, but they all failed. Marshall's idea was not total utility, but utility on the margins. We'll see what that means in a minute. But he believed that through this we could finally find that Newtonian, that self-regulating equilibrium. There we go. We've fulfilled the Newtonian dream. With Marshall, you get the transition from political economy to economics, okay? 1891, very significant year. And in this system, distributive justice is completely eliminated. Everything is reduced to commutative justice. Now, when I say political economy becomes economics, throughout the 19th century, nobody used the term economics. But in Marshall's book, it was entitled The Principles of Economics. And he had to explain what he meant by that term in the first sentence, because nobody used that term anymore. So what is the guiding principle of this new science of economics? It's marginal utility. Marginal utility means the value of the last, that is, the marginal increment. Here's the theory. People consume up to the point of marginal utility. This last unit they're willing to consume sets the price for all units. So think about this. You're thirsty, okay? And so you want a Coke. Now, for that first Coke, you might be willing to spend $2, $3, whatever it might be. But the second Coke has has much less value to you. You wouldn't spend $3 for it. Maybe you'd spend $1. And the third unit has no value whatsoever, unless you're very close to a restroom. All right, so you wouldn't buy the third unit. The marginal unit then is the second unit, and that second unit sets the price. All right, the Principles of Economics, 1891. All modern theory rests on this text. So let's look at it. Economics, political economy. The economy is inscribed in a network of laws, institutions, and social expectations. Economics. This is a science valid for all times and all places, a universal truth. It doesn't matter what the institutions, the laws, the distribution of property, anything like that. None of that matters. Well, question here, do we really gain a universal understanding of economics, or do we merely lose the ability to talk about any actual economy? Now, his theory assumes that all exchanges are monetized and marginalized. So he ignores things like gift and barter economies. So in the family, I suspect that very few of you paid your mother for cooking dinner. No, that was a gift. That's how families work. And to a large extent, that's how communities work. I mean, there's more going on than just exchange economies. And the truth is, he ignores even normal human interactions. He reduces everything to a marginalized exchange. But for this to work, everything must be commodified. Now, political economy had three factors of production: land, labor, and capital, with separate mathematics for each. But the new science of economics, everything was just a commodity purchased by the capital fund, and with one mathematical formula, that is marginal utility, controlling the price of everything. But there's a problem. A commodity is something produced for the market and whose supply is regulated or influenced by the price. But there are fictitious commodities, things that are not produced by the market and whose supply is not regulated by the price. These fictitious commodities are land, labor, and money. They're not produced for the market. Land is developed for the market, but is not produced. I mean, all that there is already exists. Labor is not produced for the market. I mean, labor is people, men, women, and all too often, small children. Now, it may be a surprise to you that money is not produced for the market. We'll see how money is actually created. It's used by the market, but it is not produced by the market. Okay, so in these things, the supply is not regulated by the price. All the land that is already exists. Labor, we don't have children in expectations of raising or lowering the price of labor. And money, we'll see how that works in a later class. All of these things are crucial to economics, okay, but they simply do not fit Marshall's scheme of commodification. Well, despite having made a claim to a purely scientific system, in fact, the system does make moral claims. Okay? One, it claims that commodified wages will always be just, and that returns to capital and labor will be normalized. What does normalized mean here? Well, it means you couldn't make very much more by owning a business than you could by working in a business. I mean, you would make some more, but it wouldn't be, there wouldn't be a radical difference. And it would lead to perfect liberty. However, there are contingencies. All right, contingencies that meaning the theory is contingent upon some conditions being present. Okay, one, there has to be perfect competition. This requires that for any given commodity, there are a vast number of firms producing that commodity, and they're all competing with each other. You wouldn't have monopolies or oligopolies, or else the system doesn't work. And you have to have the idea that labor contracts arbitrate productivity. That is, labor gets the value of its work. This is an assumption of the theory, but that simply isn't true. Labor contracts are like any other contracts. They're a question of power negotiations, and who has the most power in the negotiation sort of sets the terms of the contract. So it's one of these perfect theories with no applications. All right, let's move on. The post-war order. Talk about the crisis of capitalism, government-managed demand, the role of the Catholic Church in this, and the Great Compression. All right. From 1853 to 1932, the economy was in recession an astounding 40% of the time. So you had these astounding booms followed by these gut-wrenching busts. There was insecurity for everybody, not just for workers, but for businessmen, investors, the middle class. In such a volatile environment, nobody could be sure of what was going to happen. And you opened up this tremendous gap between the rich and the poor, which totally destabilized society. And so by the crash of 1929, the public had simply lost faith in capitalism. The science, this pure science that Marshall and the neoliberals were offering, had failed to fix or even to explain the problems. Well, this led to an era, the era that we're in fact, of government-managed demand. Governments actively managed their economies, and they used both fiscal and monetary policies. So, for example, things like unemployment insurance as an automatic stabilizer. What does that mean? Well, when there's a recession, people get laid off their jobs. This collapses demand. Well, with unemployment insurance, a certain level of demand can be maintained. And you get bailouts for banks and key industries. Now, this same policy is followed by every regime, liberal or conservative. It doesn't matter what they claim ideologically. And it's followed whether the regime is right or left, European, American, Asian, etc., etc. And this leaves us with this expanded social state. Laissez-faire was dead. Now, the Catholic Church. The Church was actively involved in post-war reconstruction in Europe. So you get the social democratic state, and in the United States it was called the New Deal. The influence of Quadragesimo Anno, one of the encyclicals we will be studying, 1931, was tremendous. It had some influence before the war, but after the war it was practically the model for the reconstruction of the social democratic states. This would be the high watermark for the church's influence in the modern world. And it worked. It led to greater economic stability with faster growth. So look at this chart. This is U.S. business cycles from 1875 going up to 2015. Now, with a chart this busy, you kind of have to, kind of difficult to take it in. But just start by just looking at the major features here. You'll see these bands of gray, and you'll notice on this side of the chart, there's more of them. And on this side of the chart, there's very few of them. And then you see this blue line, which in this first half of the chart, well, it looks like the electrocardiogram of somebody having a heart attack. All right, but it straightens out in this section of the chart. And then you see this red line. It has a low slope for the first half of the chart, and then it rises asymptotically. Well, what is this? These bands, gray bands, these are recessions. So notice how many of them there are in the area in the period of laissez-faire, and how few they are after the period of government-managed demand. This blue line is the change in GDP quarter to quarter. And look how wild it is. Look how it fluctuates and then somewhat straightens out. And this red line is the actual output of the economy, okay, in trillions of dollars. And look how it rises in this section and then explodes. So look, from 1880 to 1939, there are 16 contractions whose average frequency is less than 4 years and whose average length is nearly 22 months. The decline in real GNP, gross national product, during these declines is almost 6%. The average growth rate is a little over 3%. And the standard deviation, that tells you how wild these swings are, 7.47%. That's pretty wild. Since the era of managed demand after the war, there have been 11 contractions. The average is 5.8 years. Okay. And the average length of the contraction is half of what it was before the war. And the average decline is much, much less. That is to say, the recessions were much more mild. The growth rate was about the same, a little bit higher. And the standard deviation, that is these fluctuations, much less, much less. Okay, so you can look at this chart and see which half of the chart points to a more successful economy. But there was also greater income equality. So look at this chart. This is the share of income that went to the top 10%. So just before the Great Depression, the top 10% were taking 50% of the income. Okay. In the era of government-managed demand, however, this shrinks. Okay? And this shrinkage, where the top 10%, the share that the top 10% gets, falls below 35%. This is called the Great Compression. All right. This Great Compression gets reversed, however, in the 80s and the 90s, so that today we're back to where we were just before the Great Depression. Well, you can ask if this created the most egalitarian society in history. Well, maybe not in history, but at least within the realm of capitalist history, this was certainly the most equal society created. All right. Well, let's look at the major figure from this period, the most influential economist, John Maynard Keynes, 1883 to 1946. And he put the polis back in political economy. So We'll talk about government-managed demand, the success of Keynesianism, and the problems of Keynesianism. Now, if you recall, the neoliberal economics was entirely based on man as a rational calculator. Okay, he looked at marginal utilities, he looked at bundles of utilities and made his choice. Keynes noted that psychology was in fact more important. Market psychology can fuel a boom or deepen a bust. So when everybody thinks all prices are rising, everybody piles into the market. When a bust happens, everybody rushes for the door at the same time. Okay, this heightens booms and lowers busts. So it's psychological and not just mathematical. So fear and greed are greater than rational actors. Now, Keynes believed that the government could manage booms and busts. And it did this very simply by balancing budgets over the business cycle rather than annually. So you raise spending and lower taxes in bad times. This increases demand. And then you raise taxes and lower spending in good times. This flattens the booms and it pays off the debts you built up in the bad times. The thing about Keynes, though, that few realize is that he really didn't challenge the economic system, especially as far as justice went. The economic system would continue to operate under the theories of Marshall and the rest. But justice now would become politicized. So it would be distributive justice would become redistributive justice. You tax the best off to help the worst off. So justice becomes political rather than economic. The success of Keynesianism, the most widely adopted theory since Adam Smith. Every successful economy is Keynesian. In the US, in fact, the most Keynesian presidents were Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, George Bush II, Obama, and Trump. Why such universal acceptance? Well, because it worked. It's real simple. However, it leads to problems. Keynes was theorizing in the 30s, and his theories were soon put to the test by World War II, because war is the greatest government stimulus program imaginable. And since the war, we have relied a lot on huge military budgets. So we are on a wartime footing and always have been on a wartime footing since the Second World War. So the easiest way to implement Keynesianism is through militarism. And of course, it leads to statism. The state becomes the most important player. And you get a half-baked Keynesianism. That is, everybody likes the first half of Keynesianism. That is, where the government increases spending and lowers taxes. But they don't like the second half. All right, where the government flattens booms. They like the government, raising up busts, but not where they flatten the booms. And justice gets politicized. In a real sense, Keynes does not challenge economic theory at all. So is this really a timid approach? Did he really neglect the problems within Marshall's theory itself? And you wonder about its applicability. I mean, whether it's very specific to a given age or whether it's more widely applicable. And does it create dependency on the state? I mean, this is certainly a question that can be posed to it. And is it affordable? Okay. Do you reach a limit on Keynesianism? All right. Well, laissez-faire was dead, or almost, but not quite. You got a capitalist counterattack, beginning with the troubled 70s, and then with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. We want to talk about money and politics. and a kind of back to the future age that we're in now. Troubled 70s. Well, this was when you had youth in the drug culture. It was, it really wasn't as bad as the literature makes it out to be, but nevertheless, it sort of dislocated people. Then we got the oil embargo, the 1970s, because of the Arab-Israeli war. Oil had been very cheap because basically we were robbing the Arabs. We were paying them $2 a barrel for their oil and selling it at a much higher price. Well, after the war, the Arabs nationalized the oil companies, and they took control of their own oil. And then they doubled the price, and then doubled the price again, and then doubled the price again. This caused great problems for the economies of the West, since oil is part of every single product through transportation, if nothing else. Inflation in this country ran about 14%. Then we had the defeat in Vietnam. Now, this was very destabilizing because it was unimaginable. How could the United States, the most powerful nation in the world, get defeated by these little groups of rice farmers? It was just totally a psychological shock. And there was this loss of confidence in the welfare state. Well, this led to the rise of Margaret Thatcher in England and Ronald Reagan in the United States. So Margaret Thatcher was elected Prime Minister in 1979. And she made the Tory party into a libertarian party, which it had not been before. It had been more paternalistic than libertarian. Then in 1981, Ronald Reagan became president, and it was going to be morning in America. Okay? He would reduce taxes on the rich. He would bust the unions, and this came with the famous ATC strike, the air traffic controllers. The traffic controllers were public employees, so they didn't have the right to strike, but they did anyway, okay, because they had gotten away with it before. Reagan fired them all, and he brought in the military to run the airport towers. This led to a wide decline of unionism in the United States. And there was a sell-off of public assets in England. There wasn't many public assets in the United States, but transportation systems, mines, things like that had been owned by the government were sold off and privatized. And there was this tremendous military buildup. Okay? This was kind of odd because we had just ended a war. But the end of the war didn't lead to a reduced military budget, but in fact an increased budget. Now, money in politics. Politics has always been a question of money. Money has always been involved, obviously. There's sort of a law of political metaphysics. To be means to be funded. Okay? You can't have a political movement without funding. Well, the scale increased, however, tremendously. So you had these think tanks, PACs, and super PACs, okay, who were all involved in politics and pouring tremendous amounts of money into it. So, for example, the 2016 elections were $6.6 billion, up from $3.8 billion in the previous election. Well, there's limited sources for that kind of money, and limited sources lead to a limited range of debate. And you end up with corporate capture of government. All right, back to the future. The idea was we would establish again a free market, and there would be free trade. There was consolidation in industry and banking, so more and more industries were dominated by fewer and fewer firms. So you had, in effect, not capitalism, but economic oligarchy. And of course, free trade leads to globalization. and a new form of colonialism, neo-colonialism. And there's constant war on the fringes. In fact, there hasn't been a day since World War II when we haven't been at war. And I would argue it has led to increased instability. All right, let's look at two figures from this period, Ludwig von Mises and Milton Friedman. Ludwig von Mises, 1881 to 1973, and Neo-Austrian economics. Now, his great idea, and we'll look at this in greater detail later, but was praxeology. Economics as a deductive science from universal truths. So instead of being an empirical science where you looked at the evidence, you started out with these ideas that he had and deduced all economic truths from it. And the basic idea was axioms of action. The axioms of action for von Mises are that people only act in their self-interest, and they only act when they're discontented. Contented people don't act. The state in Mises' system has only one function: to protect private property, which is kind of a contradiction here, isn't it? If it's private property, but it depends on the state. So does that make it public property? And he denigrates the idea of society totally. He believes purely in individualism, and he calls it methodological individualism. That is, there is no social reality. That's just an illusion. What is actually happening is that individuals are just freely interacting, and it creates this illusion of a society. Now, through his student, Friedrich von Hayek, he became the dominant influence on both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. The results were, paradoxically, a bigger state. I mean, in fact, the government expanded tremendously under both Thatcher and Reagan. The other figure we want to look at is Milton Friedman. 1912 to 2006, and Chicago school monetarism. Friedman believed the central bank could control the economy through increasing the money supply in bad times. Do this by lowering the interest rates, and decreasing the money supply in good times by having higher interest rates. Now, I don't want to get too deep into this, but for right now, I'll just say money is created in banks. Banks don't lend out money. We'll look at this in greater detail later, but banks lend out credit. Okay, and that's the origin of money. It's called fractional reserve banking. So they lend out more money than they have on deposit, and they can do this because they just create deposits in the borrower's account. This theory had two big tests under Chairman Volcker in the 1970s to control inflation, and under Bernanke in 2008 to control deflation. They failed both tests because Friedman ignored what's called the velocity of money. Again, we'll look at that in much greater detail later on, but for right now, that in practice, the theory did not work as Friedman hoped it would work. And in truth, isn't this just right-wing Keynesianism? So instead of the government managing demand through fiscal policy, it manages demand through monetary policy. On other matters, he's pretty much the same as Ludwig von Mises. Okay. Where are we now? Well, I think we're in a period of waiting for Godot. For those of you who are into French existentialist theater, we're at a point of intellectual exhaustion in economics. And I think what we need is a restoration of the older idea of political economy. We'll look at sources of reform, and then who is Godot? Intellectual exhaustion. 99% of all economists missed the coming of the last recession. But that shouldn't surprise us, because since the establishment of the science in 1891, they have missed every single recession. They have never been able to accurately predict one. So the economist learns about the recession the same way everybody else does. He reads about it in the newspapers. And in fact, they cannot agree on a description of the economy. And if you can't describe, you can't prescribe. So I think there's been a loss of credibility for economics in general. The Newtonian project, the search for this magic formula, which is going to allow the markets to be self-regulating, has just failed. Okay? There is no self-regulating mechanism. I think we need to restore political economy, which involves mainly the restoration of distributive justice. Distributive justice was exiled by Marshall. But in fact, the economy won't work without it. And it's as much a technical as a moral issue. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you agree with distributive justice or not. It's simply the economy simply won't work without it. Distributions are the foundation of demand curves. And we need a teleological approach. That is, we have to ask, what is an economy for? Well, for Nassau Senior, it was just about getting rich. That's all. Is this really a rational telos for an economy? And we need a more evidence-based approach. Historical evidence, transnational and cross-cultural studies. The United States works on one system, Europe works on another system. We can compare results, for example, to see how they work. So the idea of economics as a pure mathematical science, I think, just doesn't work. You have to actually look at the evidence. You have to look at the history. You have to compare different economic systems and see how they work. Well, what are the sources of reform? I believe economics is being forced into reform by forces outside the profession. There's scientific forces, there's political forces, and there's moral forces. Scientific forces. Let me point out just a few things, because there's a lot of these problems. But the behavioral sciences refuse to confirm the economist's view of the human person. They keep telling the economists, humans don't work that way. Okay? The mathematicians are pointing out that they're simply using the wrong kind of mathematics. Okay, let's look at that issue. Compare two kinds of mathematics here. Linear equations. Linear equations deal with independent variables. And being linear, they produce these nice, neat, clean, straight lines that you see in every supply and demand chart. Well, they're treating supply and demand as independent variables. Now let's look at differential equations. Differential equations deal with dependent variables. That is where one variable goes up, the other one goes down. Okay? They produce entirely different kinds of charts. They don't produce these neat, clean charts that you've seen in all your economics textbooks. Well, the truth of the matter is that supply and demand are dependent, not independent variables. Supply and demand deal with how rewards are divided between workers and owners, or you might say suppliers and demanders. And where more to one means less to the other, okay, you have not an independent variables, a set of independent variables, but dependent variables that cannot be resolved by linear equations. The political forces, the public has just lost confidence. I mean, and this is right and left. I think the Trump voter and the progressive voter have more in common with each other than they have with either of the political parties. People are weary of bailouts for the rich and austerity for the rest. I mean, we'll look at the last collapse and we'll see how the rich were bailed out. The people who created the problem were bailed out by the Fed, even as 8 million homes were being repossessed. And they are weary of systems that seem to accumulate wealth and power. Again, this is not so much a partisan thing. It's on both sides of the aisle. So left and right, perhaps not at the political level, that is the level of elected officials, but in the population, both left and right are united in opposition to this crony capitalism. And they're moral forces. There's a rejection, I think, of this idea of value-free economics. There's a desire, an inherent desire for a return of justice. And finally, I believe, there is the force of Catholic social teaching. So, who is Godot? Well, I think it's Leo XIII. I think it's Pius XI. I think it's John Paul II and Benedict XVI. I think it's Pope Francis. I think political economy is waiting for what Catholic social teaching has to offer. All right. Okay. So, where does that leave us? As we look at this broad sweep here of history, I think we can consider the three phases. First, you had the political ethical economy rooted in the virtues, and that covers most of human history. Then you had political economy rooted purely in vice. However, vice, no less than virtue, is still, a moral question. So what comes next? Then you had the idea of economics as a pure science with no connection to the political and ethical orders. I think it's fair to ask, can this really work? I mean, can we really establish, never mind a just economy, can we even establish a functioning economy this way? Or will it require more and more constant intervention of the state until you finally get collapses? I don't know. I have my own opinions on this. I would certainly like to hear yours, however. And so I look forward to our discussion groups. Okay. Think about these, or think about what questions you have, and we'll discuss them shortly. Okay, and goodbye.